Welcome to Left In, the show where two psychology and social theory nerds explore the blind spots, contradictions, and sometimes corrosive dynamics that inhabit and inhibit the modern American left. I'm Hyatt.
And I'm Juniper, and we've both seen how these patterns and practices can result in ineffective or counterproductive strategies, leave us vulnerable to external forces, and even lead us to undermine and attack each other.
In this moment of rising fascism, we think it's more vital than ever to search for and confront our own shortcomings, collectively, interpersonally, and individually.
To successfully build a movement that's strong enough to fight, yet flexible enough to grow, so we can not just imagine a better world, but actually build it.
Today we're asking an uncomfortable question. Do protests really work? When we take to the streets, it feels powerful. But once things calm down, it can feel like nothing has shifted, like we let the moment slip through our fingers. Other times, we think we've won, but our energy gets redirected away from real change, leaving the structures of power firmly in place.
Join us as we dig into what we're getting right when we show up together, and what we're leaving on the table. How do we turn moments of uprising into movements that endure and grow? And can doing this work re-enchant us with the world and remind us what we're fighting for? Hope you enjoy the show.
And hit subscribe for new episodes every month.
Let's start by asking, what do you think of when you think of a protest?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, is just like a bunch of people marching through the streets with signs. What about you?
I think it's just expressing an opinion, like it's making thoughts known, and sometimes it can show, oh, we all agree about this. There's a lot of people who share this opinion or something, or it can make something visible that maybe other people aren't, sure about or something like that, but like it's not doing anything much beyond that, and I think, looking against like a strike, like that is actually... that's doing something. Let's not just sending a message with poster boards and a mass of people for a few hours, in some location. It's like actually disrupting like the flow of like commerce or disrupting operations of like a business or something like that. So yeah, when we're thinking about something that's effective, I think if strikes is effective, but protests, not typically. And that might be my own bias. I'm kind of curious where we land at the end of this because I definitely think there's ways it can be effective for certain things, but if we're talking about actually changing like conditions of the world at large, I don't typically think of it as something effective.
It's a good place to start when we talk about protests. We'll get into these other types of things that you could lump into protests. Often they're called direct action, right? And it's like, it makes sense that it's like that phrase because it's like you're doing something that is targeted and elicits like a concrete change, right? Or that's the goal. You have these concrete changes that you're going after. But from the research that I did and some thoughts I already had going into this, I think these like larger protests do have an impact. I don't think they're like totally useless. And so I think there's, bringing some nuance there and then talking about other kinds of protests.
What do you think people's opinions are about protesting?
I think a lot of people have a feeling that I've had before where it's like, I feel like this is important. I mean, there's often this sort of like you should go to a protest, like this sort of shamey kind of like you're a bad person if you don't go. But then sort of leaving with the feeling of like, what did that do? Like, I don't know what impact I'm having here.
I think about people who they see people like disrupting traffic or something like that. And they think like, oh, who are these people? Can't they just make their opinions known without like, I'm just trying to get home, like this kind of shit. So I think, when I think about what everyday people might think about protesting, I think there's certainly people who would be in support of things that they agree with. But I think a lot of people don't like protests when it actually like is disruptive to their lives, even if it's not even like meaningfully making changes, like, like blocking traffic or something for a protest or for a march or something like that. It almost reminds me of like when you're in a dysfunctional family system or just marriage or whatever, and like you think that keeping boundaries is getting mad at someone and telling them that you're mad. Like, oh, they did this thing I don't like. I'm mad at them. I'm going to tell them I'm mad at them. And then that's going to change things. Like, it feels similar to that in a way. And the thing that feels so deceptive about it is that it feels effective. Like, it feels like you did something, even if you haven't actually done anything to meaningfully change the patterns or to change the system. I learned this word the other day, collective effervescence. It's like when you go to a concert or you're in a big group of people and you feel that overwhelming sense of like connection with everyone. It just like you feel it in your body, this like euphoria, almost like this joyousness, and it literally feels like effervescent to me. Like, it feels like bubbly, and just like joyous. Like, and I think that and especially in these like really massive protests, even looking at the No Kings protests, like, I didn't personally go to any of these, but even just like watching them like from afar, looking at pictures, looking at videos, I felt that like feeling, I felt that like that feeling of like unity with people, that you're saying something, that we're together in something. It's beautiful. And I think because of that, it feels more effective and maybe looks more effective than it actually is. And that's where I feel it feels like a little deceptive to me. I also did protests, or counter protests rather, actually. Are you familiar with the Minutemen, that hateful anti-immigrant group from like the early 2000s? They would literally go to day labor pickup sites and just like harass the immigrants and like harass the people who were picking them up to work. So a group of friends and I would like, we did it a few times. We would go and we would counter protest them and like stand across the street from them and harass them back and like shout like whatever things at them and have signs and whatever, just to like make it visible that their hate wasn't like, going unnoticed. And I think there was something to that. I think there was something that like felt important about that, like letting the day laborers know that like they weren't alone, that like we were there for them, and also passersby saying like, oh, those people hate immigrants and they think illegal immigration is wrong or blah, blah, blah. But like these other people don't agree with that or whatever, they're actually, they see the humanity of these like people who are just like literally just trying to fucking work, and support their families and stuff. So yeah, I think, there was degrees of protest that I was involved in. And I think I remember always walking away from it feeling like I was doing something. But I think there was like maybe always a part of me that kind of knew we're just talking. I don't know if we're actually going to change anything by doing this, but maybe it's worthwhile just to show up.
That's cool that you did come away feeling like you've done something. I mean, the last one feels like it feels more direct. If we're talking about direct action as like a terminology that is helpful, you're directly confronting people that are doing something harmful and almost certainly having an impact on the people that you're trying to protect. In a way, just by being there, your protection for them. You or other people in your side of the protest would probably step in if they were trying to, do something, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's larger than just marching through the street with signs. Not to belittle that. From the research that I did, there's some good points about like the impact that it does have. And I think like you've already mentioned one, which is that collective effervescence, the sense of unity with other people. It's one of the points. It's one of these important things, bringing people together, feeling a sense of unity, feeling a sense that you're not alone in your beliefs. And not only not alone, but like, oh, there's a ton of people that believe this stuff. And I think that's important. It's an important first or maybe, early step in terms of like mass organizing and like sort of a sense of like, I don't know, belief in like a moment like this with Trump, where it's like we are fired up and we are in the street. And I think that is an important part of that. Like they have to be effective on some level. And I think it's like bringing people together, giving a sense of belief, legitimacy, right? Like that is a term that came up when I was looking into this. And it's like, yeah, of course it lends a sense of legitimacy. It's like a lot of people care about this, right?
Kind of the foundational idea, of postmodernism is that, reality is something that's constructed. Shit's made up. And then we all agree together, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Totally. That's true. And so, like, I think when you're talking about, like, lending legitimacy to something, like, in a way, like, if you look at these huge protests and, like, the sense of collective unity or whatever, then it's literally socially constructing reality. It's socially constructing a reality where we see the cruelty of this administration and we oppose it, and therefore, like, that has material ramifications.
Absolutely. And one of the like realities or like understandings is like, what does it mean when you say the people are behind this or something? And, you know, the moral claim to be like representing the people can be built by this kind of protest. Along with that, talking about like the Overton window and like shifting it. Black Lives Matter comes to mind recently as like a major one that made it like talking about racism is like a normal thing. I was listening to like a socialist podcast recently that was saying that like in terms of direct impacts of like policy changes that it didn't have huge impacts. I think that's a great start into like what are the shortcomings of this kind of like symbolic street protest. And I think the biggest one to me as like an organizer is the fact that they're not used as organizing tools. They're like great opportunities. It's not that like you should stop doing these. It's that you should just use them as organizing tools. I mean, part of the problem is that there aren't a lot of orgs ready to take in people in order to direct them into like consistent, deeper work beyond these street protests. Like, hey, here's a way to plug in now. And ideally from the speakers who everyone's listening to being like, we're so happy you're here. This is great. The next step is, pull out your phone and here's how to sign up to them or, whatever, like just a really thought out organizing process to make it as easy as possible, as seamless as possible to be like, sign up for these. Then those orgs need to be ready to like onboard people and train people. That's how you get people to invest in like doing that day-to-day work. Building on this idea that symbolic protests aren't ever the only thing that creates change, even though they're often a part of it, sort of the tail end of the process, and politicians being the very tail end of like changing policy, and they often just take credit for everything, and in history books get a lot of the credit, even though politicians change things because they're pushed to typically. Building on that idea, Erica Chenoweth is a professor, a researcher who's had a big impact. They co-wrote the book Why Civil Resistance Works. I don't know if they literally coined it, but the 3.5% rule comes from their research. And that's this idea that no movement that mobilizes 3.5% of the population has ever lost in their cause. And it's had a huge impact because, of course, that sounds like, oh my gosh, it's like we can really work toward this number. It makes it seem simple. But it turns out that it's not true. If you just look at it that simply, right? If you're thinking about street protests, if you get 3.5% of people, maybe not in one street protest, but across multiple or something, then it's going to change. Well, yeah, that's not like based on what we said, right? It has to involve so much other stuff. But if that's your target, then you can just like be like, okay, we just need to get a lot of people out on the street. Chenoweth is not claiming that like just street protests, 3.5% of people have gone to a street protest about this issue will change it. They're talking about getting people into active involvement.
So that's what this person was saying, like 3% of people who are actively involved, even in like disruptive kind of direct action stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and they're saying like phone banking, canvassing, like more active, right? And I think street protesting can be part of that. But unfortunately, it seems like even that's not true. I think an important point that actually we forgot to bring up earlier is that nonviolence is like a really important part of this like street protest stuff. And my understanding from my research is that a lot of that goes back to Chenoweth and other people like them who've done this research that like nonviolence is the most effective thing to do as well. I read this like really great book called Street Rebellion. It's actually talking about riots, but riots are uncontrolled, right? So it's not like these people that are organizing these nonviolent protests, and the book's not saying don't do that, right? They're saying that like that can be definitely effective for things, that can be a part of things, but that a lot of nonviolent protest coordinators, these often, some it's like there's a lot of nonprofits involved in this stuff, and they speak out against riots. They're like, that's bad, and this author of Street Rebellion is like, that's not really good, and it's also unfair because these riots, part of the effectiveness of them is that it makes nonviolent protests have this credible thread that like if you don't go along with what we want, who knows what'll happen? Who knows what'll happen? We might destroy a bunch of shit that's worth a lot of money to you guys, right? And it makes me think back to some like history that I learned a while back of like early on in the American colonies, poor people, were getting like screwed and they were like, fuck you. And they would just go and like kidnap the governor or some shit, just like burn shit and
Wow.
destroy shit.
Damn.
And it's like, yeah, things changed, right? Things change when that happens because it's like, well, they're able to exercise power.
Yeah. That makes more sense that it's actually strategic to be like, hey, these people are rioting. Things could get way worse if you don't like meet our demands.
What they're saying where they're like, no, like distancing themselves from these rioters and saying, we don't support that. We think that's bad, that's strategic. Certainly the people who are saying that are thinking that's strategic. And Street Rebellion says that's not strategic. What you should say, and I've heard this before, is to be like, we're not doing that, but we understand why people are upset about this issue enough to maybe do stuff like that. Not condemning, right? There's a lot of condemning violent protests, saying outside agitators, all this kind of stuff. And that's like pretty fucked up. Like, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of people who are pissed off enough to protest. And when we're talking about these huge riots in history, that's not like black bloc going out and destroying stuff. That's like normal people just coming out and being like, fuck this. And I think that's like moving in a way of like, yeah, like people are so upset that they're willing to risk legal consequences to be like, fuck this, I'm going to like destroy some property, right? Like people aren't typically getting attacked. I mean, there can be confrontations with the police, but like we know who is usually instigating those situations, almost always the police. So I think it's just like, okay, nonviolent protest is not the only thing that's ever going to change things.
You need violent and nonviolent. And like, it's when you were talking earlier too about like this, like the way that history frames like these big marches and protests and these big speeches, like the I Had a Dream speech, like you think that that's the moment that changed everything,
Yeah. The next sort of large chunk of what we'll talk about after we hit on a few more shortcomings of like symbolic protests is like effective protests, and like Montgomery bus boycott, right? Like the lunch counter sit-ins, those are not like marches, right? And those were very, very important parts of, sometimes forgotten. I mean, we do learn about those in history class, but then, the marches and the speeches do obviously get a lot more attention, it feels like.
I think that's intentional.
Exactly. I think that ties in well to the next way in which like symbolic protests can fall short is like they can be co-opted.
I try not to get too jaded, but I do get jaded, and I do get a little pessimistic about that in particular because like when I do see things that have a lot of momentum, even if it's something that like I think like, okay, well, great, like no kings, like I know that that's how typically the state, like literally the state, will take these movements and diffuse them, take that energy and point it somewhere else where they know it's actually not going to do anything. It's not going to like have any real impact. Or, it's like if you take a movement and then you have all these politicians being like, we're going to like submit this act to Congress or whatever, that they like know it's not going to be pushed through, or there's going to be like clauses in there that like actually kind of like undermine the whole thing, or they pass other secret things through it or whatever, like. And then like nothing happens, and then there was all this energy and all this push, and it's like this critical moment was reached, and then the moment just like passes. When I think of co-optation, that's kind of what I think about. I think about like, oh, people are mad, and then they're looking to somebody to fix it. They don't have the energy or the will. When I think about co-optation, that's kind of what I think about, is like these moments, like usually very like intentionally being taken like for personal gain, or I'm thinking like FBI, CIA kind of involvement, like literally redirecting the energy of like a movement or a moment even to something they know is not actually going to undermine the status quo.
This is related to an important concept that came up in the research around the shortcomings here, is that protests can be used as like a safety valve for the regime, the system. You allow people to march, to vent, then they go home, and the system doesn't change, or it changes in only symbolic ways, while people are feeling like they're doing something, radical and effective. Whether people feel satisfied by that, maybe they're not directly impacted. They're like, oh, cool. seems fine. Or they're just like the moment's gone. Like you said, it's like the moment has passed for mass action. And that's another way where like the day-to-day organizing, well, it's like that won't go away. If you're like signed up for an organization that you're committed to, yeah, okay, this moment, this flash moment of like tons of people paying attention, being willing to like turn out to protest is gone. But like if we get people into the day-to-day, then that energy doesn't then dissipate completely. So I think one core problem with the effectiveness of street protests is that they're not an exercise in direct power. Even if they can build power for later, even if they can show that there's potential power that can be activated, and those aren't meaningless. But in terms of like making concrete changes, if like a protest isn't risking repression or, they're not disrupting anything, it's probably not threatening anything. And if you're not doing that, yeah, then it's like, people can brush you aside.
When you are disrupting the status quo, that's what can piss people off. Like I think about like some place like places like France, where it's like when some shit happens, they're in the streets and they're disrupting stuff. Like they're not just protesting like with signs, they're disrupting shit, Then like that's kind of the attitude. But like here, at least in the US, it's not like that. It's not like that at all. And when you disrupt things, people get pissed, and like people like, oh, they're being really unreasonable. Like we're fighting against this like hegemony, like the cultural hegemony and the imperialist like hegemony, like that maintains our status quo.
In terms of like France as an example of somewhere where I know that there have been effective street protests, but those street protests involve like breaking shit and actively attacking the police and, in a way that makes like the politicians listen, right? There's that threat that's actually exercised of like, we will fuck shit up, and like ordinary people coming out and being like, yeah, this is what we do here. It's just different, like the cultural expectations, I think. What people are willing to do and maybe what the government's willing to do in response. But yeah, I think there's like more room to push on that stuff. But it's hard to be like, how do you can't get people to like be doing quote unquote like violent, like property destruction protests necessarily like on a large scale. Like, I don't think that's like really a thing. Before we jump to the next big section, which is like talking about more the direct action-y kind of stuff, I guess I wanted to ask the question of like, is it better not to do these like symbolic protests? Where do we land on that? There's a way in which it doesn't really matter where like any individual leftist might fall. It's just like a silly argument.
I agree. I don't know if it's even something we can like necessarily debate. I think it's going to happen. These protests are going to happen. And I think they are almost certainly great places. Even if, for every 100 people you recruit, you get 5 long-term members. That's still 5 long-term members you didn't have before. Like,
I just think it's like a huge opportunity to get people involved. It's like the exact kind of people that if you're trying to build mass movement, which unfortunately on the left, there's many people who aren't thinking about that as the way to win power. But if you are, then let's be strategic about the fact that you have this huge gathering of like people who are super fired up and in a moment, right, where they're like really fired up enough to like go out on the street.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about like co-opting, like we need to be the ones doing the co-opting. We need to be the ones leveraging it.
Exactly. Definitely want to touch on things that we said, might not fall in the realm of what most people think of as protesting. What are these more effective ways of protesting?
I feel like, an effective protest is going to be one that is going to have like actual, like an outcome from it, like an outcome that's not just, oh, I said my piece, like it's done. It's like, it's not something that's like, okay, well, I'll accept that you're a fascist dictator who's like sicking your Gestapo on our citizens, but I'm going to tell you that I don't like it. I'm not going to stay silent about it. Like, okay, that's a first order change. Like, great. You're all talking about it. You're not just like sitting in your living rooms watching the news and being quiet. Okay, great. But what are you going to do that's actually going to change that system? That's actually going to change this pattern? That's going to make an actual impact, like a real material impact. And I think ultimately, if I think of a protest or kind of protest that's going to be effective, it's going to be something that's actually going to produce like system-wide material changes to the status quo.
Yeah, totally. So expanding the definition of like protests, here are some things that came up through some of the research. Strikes, blockades, and riots. mass civil disobedience, which could be sort of look a little like what the kind of protest we talked about earlier, but has more of a tinge of maybe some property destruction, generally like disruption of the status quo, like you were talking about earlier. Boycotts are sometimes included in this expanded definition of protests, and like occupations and sit-ins, right? I think these are all things that, like you're saying, disrupting the status quo and like credibly threatening material interests.
I always think about the people that were like stopping the ships from shipping out to Gaza, like, or I guess to Israel to use in Gaza. That kind of stuff is like, that's literally stopping the flow of commerce. It's stopping the movement of like capital or of like weapons, or like, stopping the flow of power. Like if you're talking about stopping weapons.
To change like the larger system, I think you do have to impact those in power, right? I think it's easy for leftists to like be like, oh, let's create the world we want in like our little small pocket. And it's like, there's nothing like wrong with that. But if you're trying to like change the conditions for everybody, you have to like first disrupt power, then take power. There has to be power involved. If you don't have power, you can't really make big changes. I think in terms of disruption, things like strikes and blockades and riots, destroying commercial property typically, right? It's like costing businesses money. You can also cause reputational damage, which will then threaten their bottom line. I think it's really, it comes down to money, right? That's something that these coordinated nonviolent protests, it's like one day, okay, sure, like you're maybe disrupting business along a certain route, or maybe they're getting more business. I don't know, because there's like lots of people stopping by the Starbucks to get coffee before they
right.
protest or while they protest. Who knows,
Yeah.
Another thing is like threatening politicians, threatening their job, damaging their reputation, threatening them by like supporting or running oppositional candidates and stuff. That can involve direct actions, can be part of like certainly the reputational damage part of it. One other point that came up when like looking at protests and critique of protests and direct actions, like one of the key left critiques of this is that it's a tactic, not a strategy. And it certainly shouldn't be a lifestyle. If it loses touch with the fact that it has to be part of a larger strategy and protesting is just one tactic, then you've really like lost the thread there. People can understandably fall into this where it's not like a lifestyle thing, but it's just like, well, this worked before, let's do it again. If you repeat tactics, whether it's protests or something else, it often fails because you have an opposition that's also strategizing. They have power. They're trying to maintain it. They're trying to hold on to it. And they're not going to just like roll over.
They like own the resources that like propel their propaganda too. So it's a huge fight. And like I've been thinking about that a lot lately, actually. And I think it's a problem that I've been having with a lot of the left, where it's like I think we're relying on a lot of old assumptions about how the world works, and we just live in a completely different world. So we need to be able to conceptualize of it differently. I mean, I don't know. I'm a totally proponent for reading theory. I think it's great. We need to understand these like trains of thought. I think it's helpful for organizing the way that we see and understand the world and our role in it and what we can do to change things. And I think there's some fundamental things too. Like we were talking about, like you need to disrupt power, you need to disrupt capital. Like these are the kinds of things that actually push real changes. And at the same time, it's like we also kind of need to take on the role of like a scientist or like an anthropologist, or like be our own political theorists. We need to step back. We need to really observe the worlds that we're in. We need to observe how people are motivated, what our day-to-day lives look like, to understand like what are like these points of entry, where are the places we can put pressure, where are the places that we can really, or not just put pressure to have other people change things, but like to attract people into a movement. That retention problem or the appeal problem, like I think it is really important that we are looking at our world and being responsive. What are our unique needs right now? How can we meet this moment?
It's applying the theory and testing the theory, right? And it's like seeing if it works or not in real life. And like the scientific method is a good thing to use here. It's like, is this effective? Is this working? And also updating that when it stops working.
I don't know. I mean, I think the thing is too, I think a lot of leftists who are like into organizing understand this. I think it's just a matter of making it, more commonly understood this way, like how do we disseminate this knowledge in a way where like we stop looking at protest as like the end result and we start looking at it as the place where we pick up the momentum for other things. Maybe that is part of a recruitment or like a strategy for recruitment and retention. how effectively can we help people to understand that and like, catalyze that passion, that energy that they have and funnel that into something that's actually going to make like a meaningful impact.
And address that feeling that I think a lot of people have, like, is this actually accomplishing anything? Like, I know a lot of people have that feeling. I've heard that. I've heard that also from people who don't show up to protests, and maybe they would get involved in a different way, and they'd be right that there's limitations to how much this can accomplish.
So what are you taking away from this conversation personally?
For me, there's a big thing of like, oh, okay, like I actually see the value of these more. It's easy to get sucked in by like, this is not doing anything or whatever. It's like, okay, actually, no, like accepting that like these are important moments and that I don't need to like looking down on the idea, like, these liberals, this is nothing happening. It's like, no, these are like great opportunities also to like come together and be like, we're all on the same side of feeling passionate about this stuff, even if we like think differently about how to approach it. Let me invite you into like the way we're thinking about this and give you the political education where you actually have an opportunity to like think about it a different way because we're not taught that stuff. I always thought the like whole like recruitment thing was like something on my mind as like a, organizer who was really into like the idea of like getting lots of people involved and like what, the work that I was doing as well as, other orgs doing the same thing. It's just like, let's just get more people involved. I also think you shouldn't feel shame about not going to a protest. Like we said, there's overall more important, I would say, like things you can be doing. And then, just mad respect to people that are doing like direct actions that are putting their physical and emotional like health on the line. Like, I think we've said this before, but it's like, do what feels right to you and just like get involved in a way that feels good. And I think helping other people do that is like part of what like an organizer's task. What about for you?
I think something about like a few points felt really like some profound aha moments, I think, for me, just thinking, in terms of like systems perspectives, and I think that's kind of my like anthropology background coming out a bit too, like, but also, systems therapy training that I'm, just beginning now. And especially like, coming to the conclusion of like taking this sort of experimental approach and seeing this as something like, okay, what moment are we in? Like, what can we do to meet this moment, to do the things that we need to do to build power, to really, really shift society and to change the world in the ways that it needs to change to stop mass exploitation and oppression and death and fucking genocide. I don't know if you saw that post from that neuroscientist. I can't remember her name right now, but she wrote like a post about thinking that there's a new romantic era on the horizon. She thinks that we're entering a time when we're so disillusioned with the status quo and the way things have been. All of these promises of technology liberating us haven't come to fruition. And like that kind of can usher us societally into this romantic era of like re-romanticizing the world and life and like the beauty of it and the joy of it and like really taking pleasure in, what we have here is such a gift. I think in a way, like it feels connected to that where like, I feel this like kind of passion and this fire seeing these moments, like that collective effervescence. How do we like take these moments and like make them so meaningful to us that like it fundamentally changes who we are, it changes who we are together. It's enough inertia to like shift these patterns that are keeping these systems in place. I'm coming away from this conversation feeling like very excited about that potential and that like that feels so connected to like spirit and humanity to me that like I don't know how you couldn't be like moved by something like that. And I think there's just like so much potential to tap in there to really take these moments of collectively coming together and make it into something wonderful that we can look back on and be like, these are the moments that really change things for us. I don't know if that makes sense. That's kind of how I'm feeling coming away from this though.
It's probably my like strategic cynicism perhaps that's prevented me from tapping into that collective effervescence kind of thing. And hopefully like our conversation here will help me be like, yeah, this is really important that we're showing up and doing this kind of thing. What I will say is that, in terms of those like this pleasure in the work, it's there, right? And like for me, the most satisfied and happy that I've felt doing something good for the world, that really aligns with my values is being involved in like community organizing work. It's deeply meaningful. I mean, I'm someone who's cared about politics for a really long time, but it's like if you care about changing like actual like conditions of yourself and other people and making the world a more just and beautiful place and more connected and happy and all this stuff, then like politics is like one very, very crucial avenue. I hope that everyone feels a way to tap in and get involved, no matter what else they're doing.
Maybe that's the rebrand. Maybe we need to get away from conceptualizing it as just politics. Yeah, maybe that's where we need to like shift things, because I feel like politics has like such a dry, the word just evokes, something kind of dry and like inhuman, and like I feel like infusing that meaning and that beauty back into it feels so important. Like that's the moment we need to meet,
Yeah, I wonder how, that could be done. But it also, or just convincing people that like, look, getting involved looks different from what you think, probably. And it also will probably feel great, bring a lot of connection and meaning into your life and a sense of power and agency, right? Where you're like, oh, I feel like I'm making a difference here. And that's something that I think would feel really good to most people. And I think that's like a great invitation to get more involved, whether or not these big protests feel good to you. What's going to get you that sustained feeling of like, I'm involved, I'm connected, I'm actively doing something for the world that's improving my life and other people's lives, is to do that day-to-day work of organizing. And for us who are already involved in that, it's like, how do we make that more appealing? How do we help grow that? How do we start organizations in places where they don't exist and they're needed? There's just so much exciting work. We all have different roles that we can play. And I think it's inviting folks into that work is something that I think is really exciting and important.
Yeah, totally.
Well, that's it for episode 4. And season 1 is officially a wrap. We're so grateful for everyone who's listened and shared.
We'd love to know how this landed for you. Did it affirm something, challenge something, open up new questions? Drop us a line. We read every message.
Find us on Instagram @LeftInPod and hit follow so you don't miss season 2. Thanks, y'all. See you next season.